Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. The easiest and a very common way of misunderstanding the Communist Manifesto, or to just not know what to make of it, is to assume that it is a moral treatise that claims capitalism to be evil and communism to be good. Karl Marxism is in fact a theory in the philosophy of history that claims that there is an inevitable and predetermined pattern to it. That is why the Communist Manifesto begins with a statement that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Free man and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another. Classical Marxism regards history specifically as a movement of class struggles. The short version of the story is that one class oppresses another, and out of the resulting conflict, there emerges some kind of solution or synthesis. Out of this arises a new class that then oppresses another group. This history ends when capitalism is replaced by communism, which, through the abolition of private property, puts an end to class struggles in the creation of a classless society. In Marx's own time, he sees class antagonisms being recreated with the emergence of a new oppressor that he calls the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is the class of the modern capitalist, who owns the means of social production and employs wage labor. It has emerged out of the ruins of feudal society. This distinctive feature has its simplifying class antagonisms into two groups who oppose each other, rather than several classes of citizens or estates under feudalism. His oppressed class of the industrial employee, the proletariat class, consists of the persons who, having no means of production and no income-producing property, are reduced to selling their labor in order to survive. The first section of the manifesto describes how the bourgeoisie grows out of the feudal system, increases its power, and creates an oppressed proletariat class that will eventually come to destroy it. Marx was not original in conceiving history to be a series of movements of this kind. He started off as a young admirer of his predecessor Georg Hegel in a group known as the Young Hegelians. For Hegel, history was the history of philosophy and of reason. One of the statements for which Hegel is famous is that the real is rational and the rational is real. He conceived history as a series of dialectical movements, where the dialectic does not mean the search for truth by question and answer that we see in Plato. The dialectical movement here starts with an idea that we can call the thesis, the negation of which we call the antithesis. Out of the conflict can emerge a synthesis that itself becomes a new thesis. Now, one simple illustration could be with the idea of being. We use being as a synthesis. The negation of being would be non-being, which would be the antithesis. Then the idea of becoming can serve as a synthesis, which can become a new thesis. Sometimes instead of a synthesis, we may have a refined version of the thesis or antithesis, or something else that replaces or sublates the old conflict. But either way, it can become a new thesis. Eventually, we come to what Hegel calls the absolute, which unites God, state, and man. For Marx, however, the process is not a movement of reason or ideas. In his view, the belief that ideas give birth to social and material conditions puts the cart before the horse. He takes a mechanistic and materialistic view of our ideas, that our ideas are a response to the conditions that we face. And so he asks rhetorically, does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence? in his social relations and in his social life. What else does the history of ideas prove than that intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. For Marx, our ideas, not only about economics and politics, but also about religion, philosophy, and morality, constitute what he calls ideology. All these ideas are products of the conditions of our material and social existence, and constitute some reaction to those conditions. Religion, for instance, will turn out to counsel the citizens to accept and obey their earthly government and wait for justice until after death. It becomes a ruling class ideology. Marx's theories of historical materialism and ideology point to his work not being interpreted as a theory of what is just or unjust, but rather a theory of what happens. Classical Marxism also does not seek to find numerous oppressor and oppressed dynamics outside of these class struggles or to level the playing field. Going back to the history itself, the bourgeoisie springs first from chartered burghers in small towns, consisting of men given full political rights that were denied to serfs and peasants. We can imagine them originally making up a mercantile class. Meanwhile, the feudal system continues for some time to consist of artisans in their guilds that would regulate them. But the discovery of America, the opening of Chinese and East Indian markets, and an increasing demand for trade with the colonies signals a need for more industrial production. Advances in industry would assist in increasing production. This also means that industrial enterprises would have to become larger. The bourgeoisie capitalist then increasingly replaces the power and structure of the feudal system. Marx sums up this effect by saying that modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. As it progresses, it becomes like an industrial army with a highly regimented, hierarchical structure that will enslave people to both its technocracy and machinery. This logically leads into what is arguably Marx's most accurate of the predictions inherent in his theory. As bourgeois capitalism grows, small shops and tradesmen continue to exist and flourish, but to a diminishing extent. These may be called in his language the petite bourgeoisie. However, mostly through economies of scale, the small operator will find it increasingly difficult to compete and earn a decent living from his business. They eventually become industrial employees themselves in order to survive. Larger industrial enterprises will become concentrated in only a few hands, and small retailers will be put out of business by large ones. This is the process by which the petite bourgeoisie class sinks into the class of the proletarian. Today, in retailing especially, we see an altered landscape all around us, where we no longer go from butcher to baker to shoe store and so on. We just shop in the big box or the mall and buy from businesses that are almost never locally owned. Politically, it also entirely changes the landscape. Over time, revolutions in production and modes of exchange have allowed the bourgeoisie to become the politically dominant force in the modern representative state, through the development of modern industry and the world market. Internationally, it globalizes the nation-states through free trade and its ever-expanding desire for new markets, destroying national industries in the process, and forcing all countries to adopt a bourgeois mode of production. It replaced feudal and patriarchal relations with relations that solely revolve around cash values. Men of revered professions under feudalism, the lawyer, physician, priest, poet, scientist, effectively become paid wage laborers. Marx sums up nicely the current situation that was produced when he says that The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. However, the need for growth in production and exchange will occasionally create a crisis of overproduction. Too much civilization, commerce, and industry for the material conditions that exist at any given time will create an economic downturn. The bourgeoisie then seeks to solve it sometimes through the conquest of new markets or more thorough exploitation of old ones, but also sometimes through a reduction in productive forces. In this way, a so-called solution can actually lead to a more extensive and destructive crisis in the future. Ultimately, it is the workers who suffer from this, having to sell their labor to survive and only being able to find work to the degree that their labor increases capital. They become themselves a commodity exposed to fluctuations in market conditions. Here we see two things happening. The bourgeoisie defeats itself by creating more and worse economic downturns that are precisely caused by ever-expanding production and markets. Paradoxically, this is how it defeated feudalism in the first place. Then it brings an instability and a state of dependence on industrial production to the workers that they did not experience as harshly under feudalism. And so of the two conditions, Marx says, the weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. Just as the professions that were revered under feudalism became paid wage labor, these workers will also face their own kind of dehumanization, under which their work will lose all individual character. With improvements to machinery, the work will become more tedious and repetitive and require only the most easily acquired knack. In proportion to the work becoming more repulsive, the wage will decrease. The use of machinery and the division of labor will become a tool that reduces the income of the worker to his mere subsistence and propagation. The proletariat, like the bourgeoisie before him, will go through his own stages of development. At first, these people are not unified in any way, but may take action as they can by smashing machinery, setting factories on fire, or destroying imported goods, in an attempt to restore some of the status they had under the feudal system. But as industry grows further, the workers become more concentrated in greater numbers, and gain some strength by a process that the bourgeoisie makes possible. They eventually form labor unions and try to keep wages high, and will obtain some temporary victories. Marx sees these victories as short-lived, but regards the real victory in terms of an expanding unity of workers that is further brought on by improved means of communication, made possible by railways in his time. The proletarians become organized as a class that can then form political parties and political forces that compel legislation for their benefit. The class is sometimes further developed when sections of the ruling class sink into the proletariat and provide it with fresh elements of enlightenment. According to Marx, when the conflict becomes apparent in its glaring character, some sections of the bourgeoisie will join the revolutionary class. Just as some of the feudal nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so too will some bourgeois ideologists support the revolution. It will be those who, in his words, have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. This is a point on which critics of Marxism step in. According to Marx, our ideas are ideology, and as such they are products of our material and social conditions, rather than end products of a chain of reasoning and fact-finding. The cause of the ideas of the ruling class is the ideology that suits its purpose. But now Marx has some individual minds determining the true and what should be done, even if it goes against the individual's interests. This phenomenon even precedes feudalism and goes back to the Greeks. Plato and Aristotle both developed ideas of geometric justice, under which the wealthy elite are only justly entitled to so much more than others, even though they were both rich kids, as was Karl Marx. If there was some kind of causality operating, Plato and Aristotle would have communicated ideas more in tune with the sophists, that justice is the interests of the stronger ruling party. So here we have a conception of causality that says that A is the cause of B, when sometimes A is not followed by B. It is also important to note that for Marx, even though he contrasts a battle between two groups, there are still elements of society left over that he does not consider revolutionary, and thus not part of the coming battle. This includes some small number of artisans and shopkeepers who do not totally disappear, and a lower layer of peasants and social scum, a lumpenproletariat, whose conditions of life do not prepare them for the conflict, although some may be swept up in it. Here we may imagine the workers still left over in agriculture, retailing, and service sectors. The revolutionary proletariat is the industrial worker. Some fragment of the old conditions still exists for the others. As for the lumpenproletariat, Marx, on the same page in the translation I am using, goes from calling them a rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of old society, to then calling his industrial proletariat the lowest stratum of our present society. What are we to make of this? It could be that Marx did not foresee his industrial worker becoming the highest paid unskilled laborer in the economy, and effectively a privileged caste among workers. It certainly seems that way when he goes on to sum up his argument of why the bourgeoisie is unfit to rule. The modern laborer does not rise with the progress of industry, but sinks deeper, and its pauperism grows more rapidly than population and wealth. He says the bourgeoisie is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to ensure an existence to its slave within his slavery. The proletarian, in order to resolve this in his favor, must abolish the mode of its appropriation, which is private bourgeois property. Proletarians have nothing of their own to secure or fortify, and thus cannot otherwise become masters of the productive forces of society. Fortunately for them, the bourgeoisie facilitates it through a change of conditions. Normally, wage labor rests on competition between workers, but the advance of modern industry replaces worker isolation with revolutionary combination and association. And so Marx will conclude from this that the development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. This is the statement from Marx that represents what I wanted to unpack here. There is more in the second section about clarifying what communists want and to what degree they may be innocent or guilty of accusations from critics. For instance, it is here that he states most clearly that the right to property he wants to abolish is specifically the property related to production. What relates to the first part of the book also is the abolition of the family and the nation. According to Marx, the family relations become commercial, and all ties to other person of your nation or ethnicity get destroyed through a free movement of labor. He concludes that they no longer exist to save anyway, and that's why abolish them. The problem is that he is now switching to making a normative claim. The fallacy being committed here is a confusion between descriptive and normative statements, between ideas of what is and what ought to be. It was understood in Marx's time that an is does not imply an ought, that we cannot go from X is what happens to X is what ought to happen. Marx's claim is that the family and nation have been damaged by the bourgeoisie, and that it constitutes one of the elements leading the proletariat class to revolt. But what is the point of revolution if not to undo what gets seen as damage? So why push these right-wing add-ons? The prediction inherent in classical Marxism is that a process will play itself out that allows for the industrial worker to seize hold of the means of production, specifically in the most highly developed industrial countries. The inherent inference is that the countries affected would be the United States and Great Britain, where there was a more highly developed proletariat class than in Russia. However, it was the peasants and the lumpen proletariat bringing communism to Russia instead. This false prediction leads to classical Marxism being commonly rejected, while the neo-Marxists of today look to combine elements of Marxism with other theories for which they prefer to be known. So why no communist revolution in the United States? In fact, communists were hoping for it to be a result of the Depression of the 1930s and both world wars. Of course, there will be those who say it is just because of the success of capitalism. It's the great system that works. But it is, in fact, a mixed economy rather than unfettered capitalism that is working. One reason why no revolution might be that the proletarian class has too many full stomachs and is, in fact, composed of people who use their higher-than-average income to become investors and landlords. Yet Marx needs it to be this industrial worker rather than the others, because his dialectical process requires the revolutionary class to be the one newly created or modified by the bourgeoisie. His dialectic does not work if a communist state is created by a surviving remnant of something that existed under feudalism. Another reason why no revolution may be that a revolution in economics had occurred after Marx's time, with John Maynard Keynes and the New Deal economics. It promised that governments could intervene in periods of economic decline to resolve a crisis in unemployment. And this overturned the conventional wisdom of classical economic theories that said government intervention could only make things worse. Under these conditions, many citizens would and do see a communist revolution as simply an unnecessary risk, especially as long as countries that adopt communism do worse. It seems then that a way has been found to outrun the long arm of Karl Marx. And indeed, why should we take the risk that the revolution might produce a new form of oppression from a new government that seizes both the wealth and the freedom of all its citizens? The answer from Marx is that it is the end of history's dialectical process in which a new oppressor and oppressed dynamic is not created. But how do we know that a new leader will let that idea of the end of history be the thing that stops him? We are now left with only an article of faith. As for why the former Soviet Union, North Korea, and other failed states don't prove this system unworkable, the pat answer is that they did not follow the dialectical process and wait for it to emerge out of a fully developed capitalism. But why would it work any better if the revolution comes from a fully developed industrial workers specifically? There can be no consistent answer here because it is a theory that suggests that it can't happen in another way. And if it is because then there would be a greater store of wealth or other kind of development to plunder, as Marx does imply in his discussion of critical utopian socialism, that would strike me as a good argument against communism as unsustainable. If it cannot create its own success, why should we believe that it will be capable of sustaining whatever good it ever takes over? Well, that's all for now. If you like it, check out my other videos, send links to your friends, and thanks for watching.